In this video, we're going to be taking off the useless wannabe skid plate here on the 4th gen Tacoma, and we're going to be installing a full Trailhunter skid plate set from Toyota. This kit is going to include a skid plate for the engine, the transmission, the transfer case, and also the rear differential, giving the whole underside of your Tacoma the protection it needs. This install should be pretty easy, so let's get into it. All right guys, we got the tools here on the table you're gonna need to do this job. We have a 12, a 13, and a 17 millimeter socket. We have a 3/8 ratchet and also a 3/8 torque wrench. And then we have an electric impact to just make things quicker. If your Tacoma still does have that front lip or air dam on the bottom of the front bumper, you're gonna use a 10 millimeter socket to get that removed. We have a video showing you how to remove that front lip and some other things that is unnecessary to have on your Tacoma. If you guys are interested in checking that out, make sure to click it down below in the description. The last thing to talk about is difficulty for this job. We're gonna give it a 2 out of 3, so some average mechanical skills is needed to get this job done. While we get the Tacoma up in the air, I just wanna note, you don't need a lift to do this install. You can do this at home in your driveway. You don't even need a jack. You can just crawl underneath your Tacoma and get these skid plates installed. All right, we got the Tacoma up in the air. Right here, we have that factory splash guard, which is not doing anything for you. It's just like a piece of plastic with some felt on it. And as you can see, this thing is very flexible. It's not going to protect anything here. It's just gonna deflect some water. So we're gonna get this thing removed. There's gonna be a total of 4 12 millimeter bolts along the bottom here to get this thing removed. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, we got that splash guard removed. We have the Trailhunter skid plate right here. And as you can see, the Trailhunter one is gonna give you twice the protection than this thing would. Not that this thing is gonna give you any protection, but the new one is stamped steel and it does have a jack point built in. You do have to remove the full skid plate to do your oil change, but Toyota did add in these 2 slotted holes here to make it a little bit easier to remove and put this thing back on. So before we go and get the Trailhunter skid plates installed, you do need an additional piece. Right here we have a part from NYTOP that we already installed. This is going to give us a mounting point for the front of our skid plate. If you have a higher trim model Tacoma, like the TRD Offroad, TRD Pro, and the Trailhunter, you're already going to have one of these there from factory. The lower models do not. So in order to get this installed, you need to remove these 2 17 millimeter bolts right here. And on this side, go ahead and install the NYTOP piece, reinstall those 17 millimeter bolts and torque them down to 75 foot-pounds. Now you have a spot to mount the front bolts on your skid plate. On the topic of bolts, we are gonna be reusing the factory ones that we took out. So those 4 bolts that we used right here for the factory splash guard, you're gonna be using those to install the new Trailhunter skid plate. And then the NYTOP piece includes 2 bolts to go into the very front of your skid plate. The transfer case and the rear differential skid plate come with the bolts needed to get those installed. All right, so now we're ready to get the Trailhunter skid plate up in place. The first thing we're gonna do is take 2 of our factory bolts and we're going to get them hand tight into 2 of the holes so that we can get the skid plate up in place. So we have the front subframe right here. We're gonna be putting one of the bolts here on the passenger side. And then on the rear subframe, we're gonna be putting the bolt on the driver's side. Now we can take the Trailhunter skid plate, we can lift it up in place, get it onto those 2 bolts and slide it so that the skid plate can't fall down. And as you can see, we have the one hole here and the other hole back here. So once we lift it up in place where those 2 bolts are, we're going to slide the skid plate towards the driver's side, which is going to lock those bolts in so that they can't fall out or so the skid plate can't fall down. And then we can get the remaining bolts started. So we got the skid plate up in place. We have it hanging by those 2 bolts. Now we can take the other 2 factory bolts and get those 2 started here and here. And then the 2 bolts that NYTOP supplies will go ahead and get started in these 2 front holes. So we got all 6 bolts started. I'm gonna go ahead now and just snug those up, and then we're gonna grab the torque wrench and torque all of them down to 27 foot-pounds. I just want to mention the 2 front bolts from NYTOP are going to be a 13mm. All right, we got the Trailhunter skid plate up and all of the bolts are torqued. So at this point, if all you're doing is the front skid plate, you are finished. But in order to do the transfer case skid plate, we are gonna have to remove these 2 rear bolts so that the back of the skid plate can droop down a little bit, because the transfer case one is gonna go on top of the front skid plate. So we got those 2 rear bolts removed, and as you can see now, we have a little bit of play here on the back of the skid plate, which is going to allow us to tuck this edge up above that front skid plate. There is 2 hooks here. They're going to hook into 2 of the holes on that rear subframe, and then we have a hole here and a hole here where we're going to put some bolts through, up through these 2 holes and get this mounted, and then also back here. So we have the hardware here, which is included with the transfer case skid plate. We're gonna get these 2 bolts started on the subframe here for the transmission. There is only 2 threaded holes on here, so just go ahead and get these started. And this will allow us to do the same thing we did on the front skid plate. We'll get it started and lift the skid plate up in place, and we'll be able to slide it and then get the rest of the bolts in. All right, so we got those 2 bolts threaded in. We're gonna go ahead and take our skid plate. We're going to get it into position and push it forward. And we're going to get these 2 back bolts lined up. So push the skid plate until you have both of these bolts through, like so. And now we're going to push the front up and then pull the skid plate back to get those front hooks locked in, and also get these 2 bolts slid into position. All right, we got the transfer case skid plate up in place. Just make sure that those hooks go into those holes on the subframe. Now that we have everything where it needs to be, we can take the second 2 bolts and we can get those started on the transfer case skid plate, and then we can reinstall those bolts for the front skid plate as well. All right, transfer case skid plate is up. All of our bolts are started and snugged down. We're gonna go ahead and torque all of those as well to 27 foot-pounds. All right, we got the front skid plate done. We got the transfer case skid plate done. Now we can move to the back of the Tacoma and get the rear differential one done. Okay, so we're back here at the rear of the Tacoma. Right here we have our rear differential, and this is gonna be the lowest part of the underside of your truck. So if you're gonna be hitting anything, this is probably gonna be the first thing to make contact with it. So we're gonna be getting a skid plate in place, right like this, in order to protect our rear differential. There is a couple of things we need to pre-install onto here first before we get it up onto the truck. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so we have everything here on the table that is included with the rear differential skid plate. On the skid plate itself, you can see it does have a jack point, which is nice. And then we have all the rubber cushions that we're going to be installing to the skid plate before we get it up onto the truck. We have all the bolts and nuts that are needed. And then these 2 pieces here are the ones that are going to be going around the rear axle to bolt the skid plate on. Opening up the hardware, there is going to be 3 nuts inside the bag. Those 3 nuts are going to be for this big rubber cushion right here. We're going to get the nuts installed here, just like this. You want to make sure that when you place this onto the skid plate, the threaded section is sticking up towards the inside of the skid plate. So with those 3 nuts installed onto our rubber cushion, this can get dropped into the skid plate, and then we'll take 3 bolts, and from the outside, we'll get those tightened down. So we got those 3 bolts tightened down for the big rubber cushion in the middle. Now we have these right here. One of these is going to be going on either side. So just match up the shape to what you see here on the skid plate and get that dropped in. All right, so we're finished up with these rubber cushions on the skid plate itself. Now these other 2 pieces with the brackets are going to go around the rear axle. So let's go ahead over to the truck and get these in place. So looking at the rear axle of your Tacoma, you can see on either side next to the spring, there is a space right here where these rubber pieces are going to be going. So the split end is going to be facing down. So we'll go ahead and get this fished through and around the axle like so. Same thing here on the passenger side. Now we're going to take these metal brackets and we're going to put those around the axle as well, starting from the top and going down. For the one on the driver's side, it's a little bit tighter. You have a brake line on one side and you have the sway bar on the other, which doesn't really allow you to get it in easily. So what we're going to do is just pull out this one 12mm bolt on the back here for this brake line. That should give us enough wiggle room to get that bracket down over the axle. All right, so we're going to take the bracket, we're going to go up over the axle, and we're going to tuck the side with the sway bar underneath first. Start pulling the bracket down, and as you can see now, that brake line is in the way. But since we took that bolt out, we can pull that back just a little bit, giving us the room we need to get this into position. Now we can go ahead and reinstall the bolt for the brake line. All right, so we got those rubber cushions in place, we got the brackets up there, now we have the skid plate and the other 4 bolts that are included. Now we're gonna go ahead, hold this up, and we'll get a bolt started on each side just so it's hanging there. Now we can take the other 2 bolts and get those in place as well. Make sure that these rubber cushions are all where they need to be, not that they get squished in the wrong spot. So with all 4 started, we'll go ahead and just snug them in place. So we're going to go ahead and torque these down to 27 foot-pounds as well. With those 4 bolts tightened down, we are finished with the rear differential skid plate and the whole Trailhunter skid plate as well. If you guys have any questions about installing any 3 of these, make sure to ask us down below in the comments. If you want to pick up this set or anything else for your 4th gen Tacoma, make sure to head over to yodaexpedition.com. Click the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.